What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we're talking about a little bit of a surprise FAQ that we got. Today is November 30th for the Leagues of Votann Codex. Came out of nowhere, but repaired some issues and resolved some questions that people had to, in some cases, hilarious results. So let's get into it. This is going to be a relatively short one, but it starts with a change to Uthar the Destined, the named character for the faction and for specifically the Greater Thurian League. One thing I totally didn't realize with Uthar's datasheet is that he was not restricted previously. Really, Cat? Are you for real right now? You want to sit on my lap while I do the video? Nope. He was not restricted to being only included once per army, so you could actually theoretically have taken multiple Uthar the Destined. I don't know if anyone would actually allow that. Clearly, he's a special character and you can only have one, but I mean, we had the same sort of realization in the Tyrian Codex when some models that certainly looked like special characters were revealed to, in fact, not be. So, there you go. We also saw a buff to the Hecaton Land Fortress, changing its bolt cannon profile to Hunter 3 rather than Hunter 2. This one was a little bit funny for me because I remember distinctly comparing the datasheet of the Land Fortress and seeing its 2-shot bolt cannon to the Sagittor ATV's twin-linked 6-shot bolt cannon. So somehow strapping 2 bolt cannons together gave both of them an additional attack. Clearly that was a typo, and it's a little bit of a buff to the 300-point Land Fortress, which I do kind of appreciate. The other weapon available to the Land Fortress in place of the bolt cannon is the Ion Beamer. And previously, the comparison between the Ion weapon and the bolt weapon was not particularly favorable for the bolt weapon. It had a longer range, but lost a strength, and more importantly, the beam profile. Obviously now that bolt weapon being 3 shots rather than 2 is a pretty big point of comparison, and so I think it comes out a little bit more favorably, but that beam profile has seen some changes in this FAQ, specifically the errata that beam weapons are indiscriminate weapons. If the line drawn between the attacking model and the target crosses over a friendly unit, you are also going to be resolving hits against them as well, which is endlessly funny. Now, the reason that this particular section of the FAQ is super weird is that it does contradict the rules within the beam mechanic itself. The beam mechanic requires that the unit being hit by the beam attack is eligible to be targeted by that attack. This means that, for example, you cannot line up a beam attack against a unit that is character protected, shoot something behind that unit, and kill them in the collateral. However, attacks in 40k can only target enemy units, which means that this basically throws into the question that whole clause about requiring targeting eligibility when it comes to the unit being hit by the beam attack. And I think for this reason that, unlike enemy units where they can be character protected or bodyguarded or out of line of sight, all these other things that would prevent them from being hit by the beam attack, friendly units seem to be always eligible, which opens up its own huge cans of rules mechanics worms that we're going to talk about. The other option for a correct interpretation of this interaction is that this FAQ is essentially illegitimate. And honestly, I think this is the more reasonable interpretation, that the FAQ maybe was printed as a mistake and has no bearing, because obviously you have 2 directly conflicting rules. Both you resolve wounds against friendly units, but only friendly units that are eligible to be attacked by your army, by the unit making attacks with the beam weapons, which is no friendly units ever, because that's not how attacking in Warhammer 40,000 works. We're going to continue this video with the assumption that it does resolve against friendly units and overrides the eligibility requirement, but I think if were I to go to a tournament or play a game right now, I would assume it works that way, where this clause in the FAQ doesn't do anything. You could use this, I guess, to extricate your own units from melee, I think would be the number one use case of them. You could shoot over them with a beam weapon, assign the damage to units that are engaged by enemy models, and then remove those in response to the attack, and then activate that unit immediately in the shooting phase. So there we go, we figured it out. There is a reason to shoot at your own units, or at least over your own units, with a beam attack. This is actually gonna be weaponized pretty often, I think, because it is not a very easy mechanic to accidentally hit your own stuff with. For those who don't know, beam weapons just generate a straight line between the closest point of the attacking model and the closest point of the target model, and resolve wounds for every hit that was made with a beam weapon against the initial target. So, for example, if I'm shooting 8 shots, the line crosses over an intervening unit and I've hit 6 times, I'm going to resolve 6 wound rolls against the initial target and 6 wound rolls against the intervening target. That being a single straight line from the closest point of your model to the opponent's model means that it's a very fine line to tread. You're not, measuring from each individual gun on a land fortress, for example. You're measuring from a single point on that land fortress. So it's actually very easy to hit or miss things if you are moving cagely in the movement phase. But that also means that it is going to be relatively easy to hit stuff that you really want to with this effect, since you're going to be able to move into position, line up that line very deliberately, resolve those attacks, and then shoot whatever's in your way. Now, there have been some additional clarifications to the beam mechanic. The first one being that additional hits that are generated by attacks against the initial target are also considered to be hits that were rolled for the purpose of the beam mechanic. So this is specifically the case for SP conversion beamers in the Codex. If you're firing a conversion beamer, you are within the range to get additional hits. Those additional hits are also going to trigger their own wound roll on both the target unit and any intervening units as well. Last but certainly not least, the wound rolls from beam weapons are not considered to be a hit for any other rules purpose. I'm sure there are some rules somewhere in the game that trigger off of being hit by attacks, and they're not going to trigger in response to this beam damage. It's just sort of a nebulous mechanic you are taking hits from. Now, it is still getting to do, all the normal things that would happen when your models are destroyed. You're going to go through the normal wound save allocation damage sequence that you would normally for any other attack, and you're still going to have to take morale, whether or not you're a friendly or enemy unit, because that just checks whether or not you're destroyed, full stop. It doesn't care how you were destroyed. So in a broad spectrum, this last clarification doesn't make a huge difference on a game-to-game basis. That's it for the League of Votann errata. I think some hilarious things in here. I think people beaming their own stuff is gonna be a legitimate strategy. Certainly being able to extricate yourself from melee. That's usually a tactic that it requires psychic powers or out of phase wounds to be able to clear enemies that are engaging you before you are forced to fall back. And I guess League of Votann being kind of not great at psychic powers and relatively slow will now have an additional tool in their toolbox if they do have a hefty number of beam weapons and they can line up those weapons in a correct way. They can actually just shoot their units out of melee. Man, it must suck being a Hearthkin warrior within the vaunted Leagues of Votann. Just getting laser beamed by your own Hecate land fortresses. Life is cheap in the 41st millennium, everybody, and this rule is evidence of that. Anyway, that's it for me today. Thanks everyone for watching all the way to the end of the video. Big thanks to everybody who supports the channel either over on Patreon, patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, Twitch subscribers. All those people are great. I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.